Welcome to the first of 8 videos in our study of Genesis 1 and 2. My hope is that you'll discover something about the text that you didn't know before, and my prayer is that the richness of the creation stories adds some depth to your connection with God, the creation, other people, and even with yourself. One of the keys to accessing Scripture is to approach it with open hands. All of us come with different presumptions about how to read the Bible and what the stories are saying to us. It's especially helpful to remain humble when studying the beginning of Genesis, remembering that many theologies have been built on a few chapters of this book, careers have been built, and sometimes we've been wrong about our interpretations. For example, we've used Genesis 1 and God's mandate to the humans to have dominion over the earth to justify using resources beyond our means and to oppose the work of climate scientists and those invested in creation care. And I hope it becomes clear from this Bible study, if it hasn't already, that this isn't a faithful reading of Scripture as most scholars understand it today. We've certainly used Genesis 2 and 3 to talk about women being inferior and subject to men. And if we go a little further into the opening poetry of Genesis, we find that for years people created a racist theology around the curse of Ham in Genesis 9 as justification to treat African Americans as morally inferior, and therefore rationalizing slavery and opposition to interracial marriages. We know people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They grew increasingly concerned with how the Nazis were mixing their understanding of race and superiority with Lutheran theology of the creation and what that was eventually used to justify. So we tread carefully when we consider the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we relate to the world around us. And I'll try and keep in mind that in years to come, the analysis I'm presenting may change based on new scholarship. But we'll look at the text in the coming weeks with the best of what's at our current disposal, trusting God to use what's before us and keeping the rubric of love God and love your neighbor as yourself as the lens through which we filter all of our theology. So before we get knee-deep into the text itself, let's first consider how and when it was written. So Genesis as we know it is the end product of a complicated process of the compilation of many sources. The stories in Genesis were passed down orally for many hundreds of years before they were written down in various forms at different times. Now, there's some disagreement about when those sources were actually put together to create the book as we now read it. But the general consensus among Old Testament scholars is that it was written down during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. And it's helpful to keep in mind that the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were all compiled within a particular cultural context, the context of a people in exile, as a way to help them codify their God-given identity. Now, it's likely there were 2 main sources for Genesis. There were 4 sources, at least, for the whole Pentateuch, and the Pentateuch is just the first 5 books of what the Christians call the Old Testament. But there were 2 main sources for Genesis alone. And the very earliest written source we have was written at least 500 years after Moses died. Now, oftentimes Moses is credited with writing Genesis, and this doesn't mean that he didn't contribute to its authorship. He may well have. It does mean the stories were passed down orally for a long time, hundreds of years. And it's important to note that oral societies pass down their myths and their histories quite accurately, so I don't think that needs to diminish the power of the origin stories of Genesis in any way. Well, the oral tradition was passed down in Hebrew, and it was created within the context of a culture that's very different from our own, an ancient Near Eastern culture that understood the world differently than we understand it. As we approach Genesis 1 and 2, we ask ourselves, what sorts of issues were the ancients concerned with? How did they talk about those topics? What imagery did they use for it? And what genre was best suited for such conversations? If you've ever read straight through the Bible, or even attempted to read various portions, then you know it's not attempting to sound like one uniform voice throughout. There are many literary genres that are used by various authors to communicate to us through the ages. The Bible, it's a collection of disparate genres of writing, which includes history, but is not limited to history. So the latter part of Genesis and much of the Gospels would both be considered part of the historical genre. But the Bible includes additional genres such as poetry, parables, wisdom writings, prophetic writings, apocalyptic writings. Scripture is a collection of diverse voices who are witnesses to who God is through the millennia and our relationship to Him. And God speaks to humans at different times in the genre of His choice. And I think in order to honor His choice, we have to read according to the rules of the genre He's chosen. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are part of a literary genre called epic poetic narrative. It's poetry. It's the kind of prose that talks about big picture grand events. And that doesn't mean that it's fiction. It just means it's in a style that's less concerned for literal precision than it is for deeper truths. Even a cursory reading of the first 4 chapters of Genesis causes us to ask questions about the details. There are 2 accounts of the creation, one in chapter 1 and one in chapter 2. And the order of creation is different between them. We'll unpack that in detail later on in week 3. But that causes us to ask, why is that? Or what would happen if living things on the earth just grew and grew and grew and grew and nothing ever died? Would the world be overrun with plants and animals? Who did Adam and Eve's children marry? Each other? Who were the people that Cain had to be protected from in the lands where he would wander? There's so many questions. And having these kinds of questions doesn't mean that you lack faith. These questions are an invitation to press in deeper to what more the text has to offer. Let's consider the beginning of our story as translated by the Hebrew scholar Robert Alter. When God began to create heaven and the earth was welter and waste and darkness over the deep and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And it was evening and it was morning, first day. These first few verses of Scripture, they provide us with initial clues as to how to read the text. There's grand sweeping story going on here. This isn't a description of a particular place at a particular time. In Hebrew, the adverb that's translated here as beginning, as in the beginning, that adverb is usually employed to introduce a period of time rather than a point in time. This is God and the earth and the heavens and a cosmic mixture of mess and emptiness described as welter and waste. And there's darkness and chaotic waters that haven't yet been separated from dry ground, with God's Spirit hovering over it all like a bird. And then there's light. This isn't meant to be a scientific account of origins. Science as such hadn't even entered our shared human imagination and experience. That's thousands of years off into the future. And this isn't a history account in the way that we think of post-Enlightenment history accounts. This is something different. Ricky Watts describes how literary genre is communicated both through content and form, both of which in the beginning of Genesis point us toward the conclusion that we're reading epic poetic narrative. So we looked at some of the content, but in terms of the form, one of the major clues that we're reading poetry is the repetition in the narrative. There's a lot of repetition. And God said, "Let there be." And it was so. And God made. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning. Repetition made it easier for people to memorize the stories, which was important if you were passing them down orally. We also see, especially in the first chapter, a specific framework given for the creation. God spent the first 3 days building structures for time and space that could then be filled with things in the subsequent days. So the first day He structured day and night, which was filled with the moon and the sun and the stars on day 4. The second day He structured the waters above, the sky, and the waters below, which was filled with birds and fish on the 5th day. And on the 3rd day He structured the water and the land, dividing them, which were then filled by land animals and humans on the 6th day. It's orderly and poetic. It's a concept that we'll unpack a little bit further in the weeks to come.